century. Okay, we're going to have this organized now. We're going to have Mass every day. We're going to have proper parts of the Mass basing on what we're talking about today, and the ordinary parts of the Mass that are there every day. Got to have this order. And the first thing to do, cut out the women. You'll find that as we go on that women were allowed, we have nuns, they're allowed to sing, but not in the Mass. They're off to the side. They're doing little smaller events. It's not the big show. Right? It's like, have you ever had a female pope? Female priest? What are you kidding me? Does that ever happen? No. And how much time we're talking here? We're talking a couple thousand years, going all the way back to Christ. So, order. The Roman Catholic Church is all about order and organization. All right. So then, when we look at soprano, alto, tenor, bass, how are we supposed to deal with that? We just took out the top two parts, we took out women. But we just heard in the Trio Triumvirum singing the Gaude Maria Virgo that there was a very high part sung by a man. Well, there was a practice in Europe for several hundred years during the Renaissance, late Renaissance, moving into the Baroque, where if you were a young child, a young boy, who had a beautiful voice, your parents might get a visit from the priest. And it went something like this. The priest would come to your home, and they would ask the family if they would want their son to become what we call a contralto. Now, a contralto is a very special singer. But what we have to understand is that a contralto is a young boy, usually around, well, usually no later than 10, 9 or 10, who had a beautiful voice, and the church would then have his testicles removed. And the reason that you would have your testicles removed, it would keep the boy's voice from changing, from lowering. And as that boy grew into his teens and into his 20s, he would be able to sing the high soprano parts. Now, the piece I played you, the Trio Triumvirum, I'm more than certain that that gentleman still had his testicles. And while some of you may be laughing or snickering at this point as you're listening to this, it was a rather common practice. And let's also please remember that when the priest comes to your home and asks for your son to become a contralto, it wasn't a good thing for you to say no to the priest. And I had hands go up in my lectures this week in class, and they wanted to know, well, what would happen if that boy wanted to have children? And the answer is that boy would not have children. Could he still be married? These are good questions. Yeah, I'm guessing that he could, but he's certainly not going to be able to have children because he no longer has his testes. So what, scientifically, let's get into the scientific, what happens? Well, the testosterone and the chemicals that are in the testicles are what leads to the voice being changed, when being lowered. And this practice went on for several hundred years. And it really wasn't until once we get into the classical period, it started to become less and less. But it's interesting that in Italy and in Germany and in France, in the late Renaissance, it would be quite possible for some of these boys to grow up and become very celebrated singers, because they could sing soprano, they could sing the top vocal parts in a way that is unmatched today. It's not something that would go on. It wasn't for hundreds of years that women were allowed back into the choirs to sing Mass. All right, so what I want to do now, let's go to page 82. Secular music. So far this whole lecture we've been talking about sacred music. Let's go across the street here. Let's go outside the church. Troubadours and trouvères in France and minnesingers in Germany performed secular music in courts. Wandering minstrels performed in cities. So there was music outside of the church. We just don't know as much about it because it wasn't like people were making records or recording on the computers and putting it in their iPods. We weren't writing things down. If I would sing with my friend, we might have a conversation like this. I say, hey Frank, we got a party to go to Friday night. It's some people get, Sally and Bob are getting married and they want us to sing. Okay, well, do you remember that song we sang last month, about this? About that party? Like, yeah, I don't really remember it. Well, didn't you write it down? Well, what does write it down mean? So the music of the secular time was an oral transmission. If you remembered it, if you sang it enough, you might remember it. But it was an improvised, it was the opposite of order, chaos. Okay. Secular songs and dances were sung monophonically and improvised with improvised accompaniment. So while we had monophonic single line music going on in the church, we had the same kind of thing in secular music. Except instead of singing about God, what were we singing about? Singing about love. Social content. Sing about life. Singing about the same things that people sing about today. Love songs, social content, life. I can make the argument that when the Beastie Boys sang, "You've got to fight for your right to party," there's just nothing more than secular folk music coming out of chaos. And the real chaos is that when the black hip hop artists first heard the Beastie Boys, they groaned just like Little Richard and Chuck Berry groaned when Elvis Presley became the king of rock and roll, because it was another example. It's like an art form, a part of culture in one part of society was popularized by somebody else. It's like Vanilla Ice will always go down as the worst white rap artist of all time, regardless of his skills or what you think of him as a purpose. When we talk about Vanilla Ice, people just cringe. Chaos, love, social content, and life. All right. So when we move to the Chanson by Moshe on page 85, and we start listening to secular music, what we have to understand is that the reason that we don't know as much about it is that there wasn't any patronage. Patronage was literally the support that musicians would get if they were in the church. If you were a member of the choir in the Roman Catholic Church, your life was way, way better than if you weren't. You may have been a great singer, but if you weren't in the church, you weren't supported. You didn't get patronage. And what we're going to find is that as we move into the Baroque period, as we move into the classical period, patronage started to extend outside of the church. And what I mean by that, now the noblemen and the monarchs, they like the idea of having music in their court. They like having music in their castles. They like having music in their palaces. And when we start talking about Joseph Haydn, for example, Joseph Haydn had the greatest life of any musician in history, in my opinion. And that was because he was part of the Esterhazy family. He literally lived in a palace for almost 30 years, he was part of the staff of the palace. It'd be sort of like this. If President Obama, the President of the United States, had patronage, what musician would he have that would live at the White House, that he would sing for all the parties? Who would we have? Maybe like Jay-Z, or maybe Beyonce? Would he bring in Rihanna or Chris Brown? You know? Or what if it was George Bush? Who would George Bush have? Would he brought in Charlie Daniels Band, or maybe Bocephus? Hank Williams Jr. So imagine, 300 or 400 or 500 years ago, that different churches, they had their musicians, and they were supported by a system that we call patronage. As we get into the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, that patronage extended outside of the church into the noblemen, into the monarchs, into the aristocrats that had money, and they would literally hire musicians and pay them and put them on the staff, just like the butlers or the people that ran their stables. They were part of the staff. Okay, I want to take a little break here and stop this. This is the end of the first lecture in the third part of our section. Be right back.